but I think we can get started with some introductions. For everyone who is joining us for the first time, my name is Tori Mara, and I am one of 3 co-founders of Outspoken Agency. And we are a speaking agency normally based in New York City. And we have the privilege of representing some wonderful speakers just like Caroline, who we're privileged to send out to events around the world. And obviously, we are not really able to do that these days, although virtual events are starting to thrive, I would say. So we thought it would be a great time to connect our clients, our colleagues, our friends, and family with some of our speakers to share some helpful advice while we all get through this pandemic. So this is going to be a great conversation today. If you've been here before, we have done a variety of formats. Today, Caroline will be taking over and giving you a full presentation with some helpful skills and tools you can use for working and dealing with your children while social distancing. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown with that, and we'll be recording this today and sharing that with you afterwards in an email, and then we'll put that on our website and on YouTube. So I'd love to just give you a little bit of a background on Caroline. She is a personal coach, best-selling author, and teacher whose work has inspired important conversations about social skills at schools and in homes across the country. In her speaking and writing, she often focuses on topics related to coaching children and young adults with autism, ADD, ADHD, LD, executive function, or social skills deficits. So she's been a rock for hundreds of families who have children with ADHD who struggle to fit in socially. And as for adults, and what some of us are probably here for today, Caroline helps all ages deal with those executive function and social skills deficits that can inhibit our ability to empathize with our peers and excel in the workplace. So we're very excited to have Caroline today, and we're going to turn this over to Caroline now so we can learn more about this topic. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you so much for having me. And hello, everyone from a very broad spectrum of different backgrounds. So when I was designing this presentation, I wanted to make sure that I could give a myriad of different people some help with this topic. So I'm going to refer to things that can help organizations. I'm going to refer to how this can help you personally and help in the workplace, and also our children. And I think the work that I do is across many, many lines in terms of helping organizations and helping individuals. And the thing about this topic is that I picked it because it's so timely. We're in the middle of this really unique experience around the world. Many of us, like me, work virtually all the time and deliver content virtually, but I'll admit to you, I've never done so many webinars and so many virtual experiences as I have in the past 100 days. And it's a different experience, but I think we're in for some changes for a while. And so my consciousness, and so how I'll frame this is, I am going to refer to things you can do in person to learn to read the room, but I'm also going to refer to this virtual world that we're living in and this COVID experience, because we are as a world reaching this social crisis. And we know that loneliness and any kind of social struggle affects your health. And we're all, in it together. So I also will take questions at the end. And if you have a particular question for your area or your organization, please, I'm happy to put this in that context. But I'm going to share some slides now, all of which are taken from my presentations that I do for a lot of organizations and a lot of schools and working with parents. So I'm going to hope the technology works. Yay, share. So this presentation is meant to help anyone who is working on reading the room and is working on this larger situation where we have some folks who very, very easily read the room. We have some folks in our organizations and in our midst who don't read the room as easily. And then we have this extra layer of the virtual world where we're trying to actually read and interpret people's lives. And if it's a weakness for you or a weakness for people in your organization, it can be something we really want to strengthen. I know I've been working with a lot of college students and some colleges where, you know, we're now adding this virtual layer. So a student who might have done great in a lecture hall might be really struggling with certain skills. So this, I'm hoping this talk can help everybody. So I'm going to start by just saying that stress impacts your ability to read the room. We know this from research, and I feel like I'll just out myself. I think we're all under a lot of stress in the past 100 days. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we also have a climate where there's a lot going on politically, emotionally, and there's a lot happening for families and for individuals right now. And so one of the things that kept striking me over and over and over again lately is that we're under stress, we're under duress, and we're having these self-regulation issues around being a worker, being a parent, and even being a teenager or a young person, right? They have so much going on. So if you even read the room easily at, you know, in times past, it might be that reading the room right now is really difficult. The other thing I want to stress is that, to me, because of the climate that we're experiencing, we really have to consider our audience and take perspective more, because we have to be aware of what is going on in our culture and for your customers, clients, students, and the folks around you. And that's not something that everybody does easily. But it would, to me, be, if I was coaching someone in the workplace, that would be the thing that I would say to them the most, because we really don't know always what's going on for our team or the people around us. And so that's really the framing of this, is that I think the way we socialize is changing, but also the demands for all of us are really evolving in terms of our ability to take perspective, to think of who our audience is, and to read the room even when it's, you know, virtual. And maybe that's something that people struggle with. So I want to just mention a couple of statistics. You know, I've known some really brilliant people who had so much to offer, but who struggled to read the room. And I want to just share that 70% of people fail as managers because of culture fit. Well, what's fit? Fit is things that are really social, right? Fit is how you adapt to a culture. Fit is your messaging. Fit is how you adapt. We start having all of these reading of social norms and trying to figure things out at a really early age. And throughout life, it is really important to develop these skills, but not everybody does. And so we know that emotionally intelligent people outperform, but I think there's just some other information, and this may explain your child, your coworker, the people in your organization. People with high self-awareness tend to tailor their activities and their jobs to their strengths and weaknesses. In other words, we're a little self-effacing. We say, oh, I'm not all that great at that. And we pick things to do that really meet what we're able to do. Whereas people with low self-awareness often ignore feedback and often pursue jobs, social situations that are actually exceeding their capability or that require a certain level of skill and nuance. And so that's why, you may be sometimes baffled by your child, baffled by your employee, where you are wondering, well, why would they think that that's a good fit? But part of all of these nuanced things is having the self-awareness to sort of calibrate, what do I need to work on? What am I good at? And what is a weakness for me? And so all of this to me brings us to many people have to work on reading the room. We know that children with higher social skill scores are 4 times as likely to graduate from college. And I also want to mention that parents have a tremendous ability to influence your child and build these skills. And I think even in COVID, I've written a lot and I've been very much out there since this whole thing started, saying that yes, there's so many things we're losing right now, but in terms of organizations and in terms of individuals, we do have some opportunity, and that is something I really hope people will take advantage of. And I believe that organizations can offer support and even seminars on how to read the room so that we all can be a little more empathic, and it also creates a culture of openness, which creates actually more productivity. Many CEOs talk about scanning and reading the room as the most important thing for employees. It's interesting. They've done research where they asked, CEOs, what do you want from people? And they will say, I want them to be able to adapt to a situation and those nonverbal cues and read the room. Their reading of the room, that, by the way, they said didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be that people would try. And what do I mean by reading the room? I mean scanning a space for the emotions, the facial expressions, those nonverbal signals, people's energy and their context. What's going on? And what I would expand is not just what's going on in your organization or in your home, but what's going on in the world that could be impacting people. And not to sort of make us super self-conscious or make us constantly feel drained by that, but more to also tailor our message more and think about our audience and think about, how people are. One of the things I love to say about reading the room is that it's something you can work on now virtually or in person. And someone submitted a question where they said, well, what if you're trying to read all these cues and your camera is off? And my first tip of the day would be, if you struggle at all with reading the room, or you think in your organization things are super complicated, I would advise, and I know this can be difficult, believe me, I turn my camera off plenty, to keep the camera on. Because even in a virtual world, people give off body signals and people give off and show emotion that can tell you more about what's happening for them. So I know it's sort of hard, but I would keep your camera on as much as possible and use those cues. One of the things we talked about when we were designing this talk was this idea of perspective taking. So the idea of imagining other people's mental states, considering their perspective and beliefs and values. And I think, to step into people's shoes and get a sense of their behavior and then predict their reaction. So even if you're in a virtual situation, you can do what I call an inventory, which is to sit down and look at all the people you know. And if you have a child, you can do this with the child. Kids love it and they do very well with it. And to think about people's values, their intentions, what are their hot buttons? What do they care about? What kind of things do they say that give you insight into, what what your message should be to them. And I do this with college students in terms of their professors, where we kind of break down and decode each person that they're dealing with. I do this with kids in terms of their teachers and the people around them and their parents and their coaches, so that we can start to think about, you know, who is this person? What do I know about them? And what does that tell me about their perspective? And that helps you predict their reaction and what's important for them a lot more easily. I'm also a huge fan of DISC, obviously, and other tests like that. But even if we're talking about a child, they can start to sort of step into the shoes of the people around them and think about the sort of text and subtext that people are giving them. And I think anticipating reactions is especially important right now, because we don't have that interpersonal connection, and therefore we're limited to Zoom and we're limited to these virtual interactions in many cases. But we still have a lot of social data. And so part of learning to read the room is learning to think about the fact that you have all this information about people, and that information, it may not be during the meeting that you're attending, but it may be something that you can sit down and pause and think about, especially if you have to deliver a message or you're trying to read the room more. So this is my cute little spy guy. And if you're an adult, don't let this throw you off. One of the things we know about people is that many people who struggle with reading the room are not great observers. So they are just not observing what's going on, and they're not observant people. And I think we really have to remember that stress is greatly affecting all of our abilities to observe and all of our abilities to detect what's going on for those around us. Sometimes, you know, it's Maslow's pyramid of needs, and when we are, you know, feeling so much stress, feeling so much change, we're probably less likely to connect and really pause and look around our world. So I will tell you what I do with SPY with children, and then I will tell you what I do with SPY with everyone else. The idea behind Social SPY is that I take children and I teach them to watch without directly watching, and to observe specific behaviors or specific situations, so that they learn to pick up all of those subtle pieces of social information. They can use it to learn what people are talking about, what people are feeling, to learn more about people. And it's not to be leering at people, but it's just that experience you have where you're kind of, you know, observing and watching people watching. And I do this with little kids. I do this with kids who are on the autism spectrum, and we rehearse and we go into the world and we spy. Now, when I refer to these lessons, I'm going to talk about this in terms of sort of the virtual situation we're in, and then, you know, some of the things you can do when things are opened up a bit more, depending where you are. But, you know, for adults, what I would say is, and teenagers, it's still a great thing to do, because when you go to a gathering or you go to a meeting, how often do you go in and just barge in and start doing versus hanging back a little bit more and actually allowing yourself to observe? You know, it's almost a little uncomfortable for us as adults sometimes, because we worry that, you know, we need to talk more, or we need to engage. And you do, but there is real value in spending a meeting holding back a little bit and really being an observer and trying to spy and see, what are people doing? What are they saying? What do you notice about their facial expressions and their body language? You know, what do they say that gives you insight for that inventory about who they are and what's important to them. And to also, we're going to talk about mood and context to be able to really read those things. So what I always say to people is, if you are struggling with reading the room or you're trying to teach someone to read the room, and I go into this really extensively in my book, Why Will No One Play With Me, but just to give you sort of a little snippet, being a spy and observing is one of the best ways to get started, so that you have in your mind a mission that you're working on, and you're going to observe other people and see what you can come up with. So this is a bedrock foundation of reading the room, and so I wanted to make sure I included it because I think people can do this even in the virtual world. Reading the mood is a really nuanced thing, and I think it's really important right now. There's the mood in social media, there's the mood that's coming from other forms of media, there's the vibe and the mood at your organization, within your family. There's a lot of moods going on, right? And reading the mood is a more nuanced thing, especially for people who struggle with social skills. So when I work with a technology company or certain other organizations, one of the things we work on is sort of this mood component. Because if you think about mood, it's subtle, right? It's a vibe that you get. But one of the things I've done is I've broken down that reading that vibe into actual exercises people can do to build that muscle. And part of that is social spy, is hanging back a little bit and starting to become an observer. So one of the things I kept from this whole lesson is to pick 2 family members. This can be 2 coworkers, this could be 2 people that you know, this could be, 2 members of your book club, but to pick 2 people and identify what they do with their body and their voice in different moods. So if you have a boss who's a little obtuse, right, and you're trying to read them, or a college professor or a teacher or your child, you're trying to figure out what's going on with their peers, if you identify how people act with their body and voice in different moods, then when you see them do something, now you suddenly have a playbook. Now you suddenly know, what's going on for that person, possibly, because you can see how they act. So I'll just give a personal example. I'm rarely quiet. And if I am, it usually means that I have, a headache, or I don't feel well, or something's going on with me. So if you were trying to think about the people in your life and how do you teach someone to read the mood, part of it is identifying what symbols are and what body signals are people exhibiting, and also what's going on contextually, right? So, what do you know about that person, and what can you get to know about them? And even in Zoom, I think that this is very possible, because often we have, a weekly call or a weekly Zoom with people. I know I'm on this one committee where I notice people have habits and people have patterns, and some people talk a lot and some people talk a little. So those patterns help you read the mood, because you can look at how people react and behave in certain circumstances. The other thing is, I do think we're beginning to go about in masks and open up a little bit. And one of the best ways to learn to spy on people and to read moods and to read the room is to take what I call field trips. And I do this with adults as well as children, which is to go to a public place like a mall or a box store or a hotel lobby, and to spy and look and observe folks. And I have in Why Will No One Play With Me very specific activities that people do, and it helps them build that reading the room muscle. I know that in some states we're not opened up, and in other states we are, but I included this because I have been told by immunologists that, as we open up and as things are, open air cafes open and things, we are going to be able to go around in masks, and we cannot always read people's full facial expression because they're in a mask, but we can still read certain things about them. One of the things I always ask kids to observe is who is the person who's in charge, but they don't actually have a name tag and say that they're in charge. There's always somebody who sort of takes over. And you can still read that by the fact that they're the ones giving everyone orders, or they're the ones doing so much. You can still see people's eyes and the expressions if they are wearing a mask. You can still hear what people are saying. So part of all of this spying is to start to become these great observers who really think about what people do habitually and also what's going on around you. Many people who don't read the room enter a situation and they don't sort of pause and take stock of what's going on. And I would argue that I see the same thing in the social media and things too. I see the same thing in terms of employees and folks sending emails and sort of giving certain messaging that isn't as well received. Do you send a super salesy email, when there's certain things going on for people and families? Maybe you don't, maybe you take a more helping perspective. So I think that observing muscle we can still do, because we can still go to some of these places and we can still start to notice what's going on around us. Because I would argue that scanning activity is really part of this bedrock of reading the room. And the more you get used to entering a situation, whether it's virtual or in person, and giving it a scan, the more you're going to become a better reader of the room. One of the things I ask kids to do is to look for who is the grumpiest employee. I would tell you that I just did this in masks with someone, and I have to tell you, they were able to identify they went with their parent, not with me because of social distancing, but they were able to identify someone as being grumpy based on the work we had done on verbal and nonverbal cues. But part of this is that when people are in a hurry, when people are having a faster paced tone of voice, it signals something to you, right? It signals to you that they are busy, or they don't have time, or that they are stressed. So one of the things I always say to people who are learning to read the room is, you could literally make your mission for the next Zoom call you go on, or the next social event you go to, or the next interaction you have, to just try to notice things like, what is the pace of language for people based on their mood? If they're stressed, what do they do with their voice? If they're in a hurry, do they talk faster? If they're, feeling apprehensive and they may not be buying into your message, do they speak more slowly, or do they ask more questions? Because that's the kind of thing that we need to observe, and it tells us so much about the people around us and what they're thinking and feeling. So that's just something you can do no matter what the environment. I want to talk a little bit about context. Context is another nuanced aspect of reading the room that people often miss. And I would argue that you can really spend your time and make your sort of mission be to read people, the context more in situations. Context is this nuanced thing, right? It's the situation, it's the mood, it's the circumstances. And interpreting the context helps you adjust your message. And one of the things I always work with folks on is that when you enter a situation, even a meeting, right, or a Zoom call, or a family hangout on Zoom, is to pause and think about where you are, who is there, and what is the situation. Because those are 3 indicators of the context. So, you know, who's there, what are they up to, what do you know about them, what's the environment. The environment tells us a lot about how people are going to behave and what context they have. And I think a really great skill for reading the room too is this ability to hang back a little bit, because sometimes in these Zoom situations, it's not as easy to tell the context. It's not as easy to tell what's going on. But if you hang back a little bit and you try to observe, then you're going to hear that message, or that context is going to, you know, come forward for you more than if you sort of go right in and you just start talking. And so again, the ability to sort of scan and spy a little bit, you know, spying on what's going on and what are people experiencing, can be a really great way to uncover context in a time when it's not as easy. The other tip that I have is really around empathy, which is that you may not know everything that's going on for everyone around you, and you can't know. But if you operate from a place of thinking that the folks around you and your audience are probably stressed, are probably experiencing a lot, are probably dealing with some uncertainty, then you're taking action by simply self-regulating your message and giving them that feeling or understanding that you get it, you know, that you're not going to, you know, be coming in like a bulldozer. You're going to give them a softer message, and it plays better. And I think for kids, the more we teach them to spy and the more we teach them to look at context and to understand that it exists, the more they become better readers of the room. And I do a lot of work with kids around what is the situation, and this idea that we adapt our actions based on the situation, and we practice and role play actually entering situations and trying to observe codes and unspoken signals of what is going on for people. Context to pay attention to is, you know, someone is really busy, someone is sad, someone is happy, sensitive topics, you've been lucky and they have not. It kind of probably seems self-explanatory, but these are also the contexts where I've noticed people kind of get in trouble, where they, you know, fail to read the room and to think about, you know, the fact that not everybody in a situation is having the same experience you're having. And so I really spend a lot of time working with people on thinking and stepping into other people's shoes and thinking about what is going on for them and how you adjust. This is my Who is Your Audience tool, and I developed this with a young person who was a theater kid, and I was a theater kid, I fully disclose. And we kind of came to the conclusion that everybody you encounter is just an audience. And this is a great way to think of people and to think of reading the room. Because if everybody is an audience, then you're adjusting how you perform or what you do and how the message will be received depending on your audience. So you want to think about, what information am I giving? Why am I talking? How will it be received? And then again, this goes back to our social observer spy self. What's the text of the conversation, and then what's the subtext of the conversation? And one of the things I work a lot with people if they're trying to learn to read the room more is to hold back so that they can actually hear the text of a conversation and then decode the subtext. For some people, their brain does not do this automatically, and they really take things in a very literal manner. And so for those folks, sometimes those nuanced messages that we send them, just they don't pick up. And so what we do is we give them practice in understanding subtext and then interpreting it and looking at, what is the person saying and what do they really mean. And this is a whole, reading between the lines skill, but it really is important because a lot of times when we give feedback to employees, when we give instructions to someone, when we work with our own children, if they are very literal, we're assuming that they are reading that subtext, that they're getting the nuanced subtext of a message. And we say things that are very vague, like I need to see more, or I want to see you be more gracious, or we need to be kinder. And if people have very literal thinking, or even just they're confused, they may not read what is it that you're trying to say. And so without being harsh or blunt, we have to more paint a picture of what we're looking for with certain people because they don't necessarily read that subtext. On the other hand, people who don't read the subtext are sometimes really aware that they don't, and it really is disturbing or troubling for them because they're aware of that skill gap. And so I work with a lot of people on how do you build that subtext and how do you learn to read between the lines. And it's really gratifying because it really helps people so much. I want to just mention that, we want to pause and consider how your message will be received in terms of emails and social media and texts. And one of the biggest things I suggest to people is to think about who their audience is and to really also get comfortable with pausing and with, giving that even text or email a second look and even leaving it overnight and considering and stepping into the shoes of another person, especially if they struggle with reading the room, to just role play a little in your head and step into the shoes of the other person and think about how that message will be received can really cut down on a lot of conflict. And it can make sure that we telegraph what we want to be telegraphing, right? So with teenagers especially, we work a lot on, interpreting what they receive, and then also how do you learn to make sure what you're writing back is what you intended. But I feel like I do that with a lot with adults too, and I think right now, since we're in this virtual environment, dashing things off and thinking about them less is probably not the best idea because there is so much going on for people. And if we pause for a second, we tend to be able to step into their shoes and think about what's going on for them, or even things we've forgotten about people's history that we may want to consider, especially since we may not have that interpersonal context where we're with them all the time. Oh, and there's my little arrow. I want to leave you with how to practice this because practice makes things better, and there is a lot to this. When you work on reading the room and learning to read the room, it really is a series of activities and assigning yourself missions or things to work on or focus on, and then practicing them almost, one at a time. So a person might say, I'm going to practice hanging back and interpreting what people are saying in a Zoom meeting, or I'm going to practice pausing before I send things and stepping into people's shoes. And I always encourage people to pick one mission, because what people tend to do is they sort of say, I'm going to work on reading the room, or I'm going to work with my child on reading the room, and they try to work on everything at once, and then it's so much. But if you think about these skills in their sort of parts, you're going to have a better success, right? So if you think about it, if you go for the rest of today and you really decide you're going to leave your camera on and you're going to interpret people's body language, and you're going to, just try to read people's facial expressions, you're going to have a much better success rate than if you sort of are trying to work on everything. I really, really enjoy helping folks with this. It is a life-changing skill. We know that people who develop this skill literally do better in life. I work with kids who are 5. I work with people who are 50, 65 years old, and some of them are just brilliant, but this isn't their forte. I see that there are questions. I'm sorry, I couldn't quite see them during the presentation, but I know we have some pre-submitted questions, and I see there's some stuff in the chat. So
should we go ahead and do one of the pre-submitted ones, and then that'll give everybody a moment to think about anything they might have?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll go ahead and read one of those. We had one pre-submitted from Francine, who asked, what does one do when they can't absorb and process conversations quick enough to be part of the to and fro in conversation? By the time a person fully absorbs what is being said, the appropriate window to respond is past. This leads to missing out on a lot of social connections and ability to have quick chit chats with all kinds of people you meet randomly. Any advice on this? I think you kind of started to touch on this.
Yeah, so some people's processing styles, the way their brain processes information, or stimuli in their environment make it harder for them to process and absorb a conversation. So there's a few things. One, I would practice. I would make that the thing that you're working on, because a lot of times when I work with folks on this, they get so anxious and so fixated on all of the things they're not doing that it makes it really hard for you to actually, give yourself credit for all you are gleaning. The other thing is that I think also my experience with people is that they tend to be really hard on themselves about how long they're taking to process. And in reality, I've done this often where we actually time them, or I actually sort of, observe. And what I find is it's only a couple of beats, but to you, it feels like an ocean of time. So I would also sort of be a little more observant of, how many beats is it for you to process? And is that really so different? Because it might not be, and it might be okay. And it might be that the person you're talking to really doesn't think about it. I will acknowledge that when people struggle with this processing issue and there's fast-paced conversations, they do often feel like they didn't jump in, or they didn't make that fast chit-chat you're referring to. And there's a couple things. One, to practice jumping in. And to practice making that chit chat. The second is people love to talk about themselves. So if you ask some questions, it actually buys you some time to process and think of things. And people love to talk about themselves. So it gives you like a little out. But my biggest thing is that I would sort of give yourself a little bit of a break on that processing time, because a lot of times it's not as long as you think it is. And it's okay, and people aren't completely thinking about it the way you're thinking about it. But I grant you, if it's a fast-paced conversation, that's something we definitely should practice.
That's great. Real quick, Kate is asking, are there other books or online resources you recommend? And I know we'll be sharing some resources after, so perhaps some of those will be included in the email, and certainly we'll link to your book in particular and your website. So do you think there are some other ones we'll include beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that no other book has ever given a complete how to read the room lesson track, which is one reason I sort of charge myself with doing it, because I think it's just so important. But there are some other resources in terms of reading the room, and even sort of videos about body language that we could include, that people could watch, and TED Talks.
Great. Michelle says, I like to think that I am pretty good at reading the room, but what do you do when those folks that seem to have a poker face and you cannot figure out what they are thinking, feeling? How do you deal with that?
That is such a tough one, and I feel like adding masks to that is just going to be really complicated. But, you know, a lot of times people have an open face like mine where everything shows across of it, and then there's other people who do have that more poker face. And I think that's where you want to use your spy skills, and you want to get to know someone better and hear from them their perspective on things. Again, people love to talk about themselves. So if you're encountering someone regularly in your life where they have this poker face, you can have conversations with you that give you information that allow you to make guesses about how they'll receive certain things or what they're feeling and reacting. And I also think that with certain people, depending on your level of intimacy, you could ask them how they feel about something and just hear it from them. But the other thing is that sometimes people are so fixated on the face, because, you know, it's a poker face, that they're sort of lost in hearing what the person is saying, which might give you more insight.
That's helpful. We had a pre-submitted question. I think some of this you may have covered, but you probably can expand on it. This is from Becky, and she asked, in what ways do you think the guidelines for new social norms, such as mask wearing and social distancing, will impact people?
I think that I'm not going to lie, they're going to have a profound impact on people. I totally understand the necessity of it, but I think, you know, we are going to have to try to, instead of looking to go back to normal, to understand that there's going to be this new normal. I think that for folks who don't read cues easily, we're going to have to do a lot more to help them to understand the unspoken rules of this new social distancing. Yes, we are all told to be 6 feet apart, but that means subtle things like when you're in the supermarket, not to touch, you know, every melon. And for those folks, we're going to have to give them more guidelines. And I think for the rest of us, I think social is so important that we're going to have to find a way to connect. And being outside, you know, I'm told by immunologists, is really safer, and to connect and kind of be social and be together and be connected, even if it's 6 feet apart in masks, because I think as humans, we really need it. And the past 100 days have been hard, but I think it's going to mean we're going to have to employ our creativity.
Yeah. Melina asks, what are some strategies for reading the room over Zoom when you can't see much of that body language or folks have their video off? Sometimes I know we're calling in, I guess. Maybe that's the same with just conference calls as well. We're dialing in more than we're in person in meetings. So any strategies there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is, if you are in charge of the meeting, you could ask people to turn their cameras on. And if I were you, I would keep my camera on as much as possible, because it it is a cue for you, right? But the other cue, if people don't turn their camera on, which obviously we can't force everybody, and I'm just as guilty of having moments where I'm like, I just went for a run, I don't want my camera on, is to listen to tone of voice. People show how they're feeling in their facial expressions, but they also show it in their tone of voice. And so to sort of listen more carefully for those intonations. I also think it's completely legit, and I've found this in working with groups, where to ask someone, I'm not really understanding how you're feeling about this, without calling anyone out, but just to ask people their reactions, because you're not in the same room and you can't see someone cross their arms or shift a lot in their seat, so that you can read how they're doing. And I think the other thing is to try, if you're in groups where you're having this dilemma, to maybe bring it forward and come up with ways that you all can really discuss things more openly, because we aren't able to read things as easily. But I would say, as much as possible, cameras on, and listen for those tones of voice, and think about your audience, right? Who are they? What do you know about them? How do you guess they would receive a message? Because that often is the big decoder.
Any advice? I'm just thinking, we don't have any other questions submitted, but sometimes we're getting on Zoom calls or phone conversations with people we've never met before. Maybe we're starting new jobs, maybe we're in new situations, maybe we're on these webinars that we're all joining in. How do we engage more thoughtfully with those people we've never met before? I think maybe some of these tips are involving people our colleagues and employees that we were in the office before, so we kind of had a background story to that. But is there anything more specific to these new situations?
Yeah, I mean, I've been advising people to go forth assuming certain things that can't hurt anyone, right? So assume people are a little bit besieged. Assume people are stressed and tired and, homeschooling and really have a lot on their plate. Assume people are affected by the political and emotional climate and what's going on. Because if you come from that place where you're being more careful and thoughtful, you kind of won't go as wrong, right? Versus a place that's a little more laid back, a little more casual, a little more off the cuff, right? So I think you're right. We are in new situations, and there are people starting new jobs. There are organizations reorganizing, and there are situations we're in where we don't know anyone. The other thing is social norms, right? So what are the social expectations And so if you're entering a Zoom, one of the things I've seen people do a lot is to sort of dominate the pre-meeting chat, and sort of take over or go down certain rabbit holes and dominate. That goes against the sort of social expectations, because you're not giving anyone else space to just sort of go back to sort of your playbook of, how do you want your brand to be? How do you want to project? What image do you want to project? And, and what do you want to notice about people? Even if they're new, there's things you want to stay away from.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So it doesn't look like we have any other questions. I don't know if you want to leave us with any final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this is an incredibly important time in terms of our taking the perspective of other people and reading the room for people of all ages. And I think that organizations can offer support to their members. And I think it's not something everybody is talking about, but everybody is longing for it. I don't see a lot out there offering people support and offering people training or information on this, but I do see a lot out there where people are saying like what we just said about Zoom and things they're struggling with. So I think it's such an important life skill. And if you or someone you know is struggling with it, or you feel like your organization is, it's really a good time, I think, to ask people to work on it, because I think that everyone is so acutely aware of how important it is right now.
Right. And you're going to be writing more about this in some articles, so that's something that people can be on the lookout for, right?
Absolutely. I'm going to be spending my summer responding to this social crisis and giving people everything I can think of.
Amazing. Well, we can all use more of that. I just want to thank everyone who's hung on the line with us through the end of this conversation today. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Caroline, so much for presenting us with all of your knowledge on the social skills issues that we're dealing with right now. As I said at the beginning, we will have a recording of this sent to you hopefully by tomorrow afternoon, with some additional resources from Caroline so that you can share with others. And we will be back again next Thursday for another conversation. Thanks again, Caroline, for joining us. We really do appreciate you, and hope everyone has a great and safe afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Bye.